Hey guys, what's up? Razor here, backing out another video, and today I wanted to make my own crappy tier list, and this is probably one of the worst tier lists out there. I already made it in advance. This is a Constellation 6 only Ultra Mega Leviathan tier list. So it is probably going to be 1000% useless to most players, but I figure most players just want to see where is the highest. If every character was the highest they could possibly be, what is the limit, essentially? And so, again, this is my own personal opinion. Please do not bully me in the comments below too hard. And one disclaimer is that there is no tiering within tiers. And what I mean by that is I'm not saying that Mona is the best A tier in here. I'm not saying Mona is better than Fish. I'm not doing Mona is better than Kaya, etc. It just turns out that this is just a lot of fine tuning and granularity and just very much nitpicking on certain aspects, which I just don't think was the point. And I just put them in a general category instead to match what suits them best. But anyways, let's go down and explain each character's placement one by one. Starting off with the S tier, we got Bennett. I mean, everyone knows that Bennett is really freaking strong. He's great. He's a decent healer, and he provides solid damage, solid energy regeneration, as well as that big juicy attack buff. Obviously, C1 is what you really want because now you don't have to fit the requirement for the attack buff being 70 or higher, which makes him a lot easier to use, and he's just a very good character. There are some downsides, in my opinion, such as that you have to stay in the field, and the field can be a little bit small at times, especially when characters move across, like, where they're supposed to be sometimes, like Fatui guys, like, jumping out or moving around, messing things up. But overall, he's still a really, really good character right now, and especially for cheap-to-plays with the C1. Moving on to Venti. So, we all know why. Venti just really good at grouping small enemies together. Pretty much carries Abyss 7. Oh, sorry, Abyss 7. Abyss 11 too, in particular, is an easy Venti check. Just gake all the small boys and group them up together and just one-shot them usually. Very good for a lot of characters. There are some downsides to Venti. A, he doesn't work that well on bosses, and B, sometimes when you have enemies trapped inside Venti's burst, your melee characters can't hit correctly, which is why he's better off with ranged characters for the most part, so you can almost guarantee the hit. But he's still really good value, as well as he has some good energy recharge value from his passive. So again, really, really good character. Really good for, even as a C0, but C6, he also gets access to a res down, a bunch of res downs, and a bunch of DPS value. So if you give him with a harp, he can do a lot of damage. Very good character overall. Zhongli used to be almost in B tier, to be honest, but now he jumped to S tier. So to explain why the change is, the biggest change to him was the resistance down, and the shield just got way more tanky. Other than that, those two were really good. Also, his C4 and his C2 carry ridiculously hard for whales. All you gotta do is fire off burst, and you get your broken shield for everyone, especially if you're in co-op. And you get the longer duration on the Petrify. And what Petrify does, what makes it so good, is that it can petrify the bigger mid-trolls or even like really big enemies and keep them kind of stuck. And especially for mid-trolls with shields, you kind of could just shoot around the shield. You don't have to worry about the shield. And sometimes, especially for characters like Ganyu, getting through the shields is kind of like the most annoying part. But there, we all know Zhongli is pretty freaking solid, especially with the new Homa weapon, but I digress. So, Xingqiu. Xingqiu is insane, like, as a whale, at the top ceiling of a whale in this game. So what I mean is, if he has an R5 sack sword and some decent investment into his kit, he does a lot of damage. Currently, my Xingqiu has 60% crit rate and 100% crit damage, and level 12 talents on both the skill and the burst, and with this R5 sack sword, and he's capable, essentially, with the sack sword of hitting roughly, 80,000 damage if the sack sword procs, which is pretty nuts, all things considered. And he also, on his Q, get a lot of the benefits from the constellations. They hit harder, they last longer, the Hydra res down, and very easy combo you can do with him is press Q, left click once to fire off the swords, get the res down, and then fire off E twice for your 50% damage bonus. It does a lot of damage. It's really, really good. I really like sack sword on him. I think it's better than all the other 5-star weapons at the moment for him. It just is perfect with his kit, especially with the biggest problem of his kit being that he has generally long cooldowns. and a really good damage modifiers on the skill. It's like 300 to 300. It's almost like a burst ascent. It's basically stronger. It's actually stronger than most people's bursts in the game if you get the sack sword, because it essentially gives you 1200, whereas Zhongli's is 965. So that just shows you how good of a character he is with the sack sword active. And then I'm sure most people already know he's really good. So most people, I usually don't put DPS as an S tier, but I had to make an exception for Xiao. I absolutely had to. So the main reason that I am putting Xiao up in S tier is his C6 is just so good. It is so broken on some characters, because essentially, for those that have no idea what C6 is, as long as you hit 2 enemies and plunge while in burst, you can infinitely E for 1 second, which is generally around 3 times. And so the easiest combo you can do is plunge and then press E 4 times, and then it'll bring you back to your original position if you did it right. So you zigzag, and then you do it again, zigzag. And then the thing is that it also stacks with his passive, so it's going to be dealing more damage, as well as his first passive, which does more damage as you stay longer in burst. So he just does it. This compounds over time, and I haven't invested too much in Zhao personally, but I've gotten mine to do like 50, 60k per skill usage on some Abyss 12 enemies. It's pretty good, and it easily wipes the floor with them. One of the biggest problems I find with Xiao, though, is that he does suffer a lot, especially on the current floor 12 environment with interruptions. So that's why having a character like Zhongli or Diona is really going to help his kit. Another problem I've noticed with Xiao in particular is that if without Venti or something, a lot of the times you'll be spending your burst just running towards enemies across the Abyss floor, which is kind of annoying and just a waste. All you do is lose HP. It doesn't really help you that much. So I do like pairing Venti as well. And my current team is Xiao, Zhong, Jean, and Venti in particular. It's a 3 Anemo team. There's no reactions, but it does so much damage, it doesn't really matter that much, all things considered. So moving on to Hu Tao, and I think this may be a little bit of an overhyped character, but I actually do believe with the whale ceiling, Hu Tao has a potential to do a crap ton of damage. And not only that, he's able to cycle into your team, especially with the C4 ability. You're able to sort of cycle better into other characters, and as well as not have to worry about stamina costs and just deal more damage on Blood Blossoms as well. C6 is not really that great, but you're going to get, if you have an R5 Homa, you're going to have so much attack on her, like it's not even going to matter. It's like, she's going to be so good, especially with these reaction comps. If you have like a EM timepiece with the R5 Homa for a whale ceiling, it just turns out that Hu Tao is just has a lot of potential, lots of very good potential. I may be overestimating her. She may end up dropping down to A+ tier for this whale tier list, but right now I'm going to tentatively put her in S. So Jean is a very interesting character, and you may think, wow, Razor, Jean, really? And I was actually thinking about putting her in A+ tier, but I actually realized, just thinking about it more and more, Jade Cutter is really, really good on Jean. So not counting Hu Tao right now, Hu Tao will have the highest base HP when she comes out. Jean actually has the the current highest base HP, tied with Zhongli, and the Jade Sword on her is absolutely freaking broken. It's really, really good, and she has insane modifiers on her skill and her burst, which requires her to do really, really good damage. And not only on top of that, she has some of the best healing in the game. With her burst, if you set her upright, she has the best healing in the game. Insta-heal everyone on team. The biggest problem with a lot of the heals in this game is that they only heal one person at a time. So if you have 3 people that are seriously hurt, it's really much of a pain for Bennett to get them all up, essentially, and keep your attack butt at the same time. So you essentially just kind of lose some healing. You have to sack some healing. But with Jean, you just press Q, and then everyone's full. And then on top of that, as long as you stay in the field, you get even more healing, which is just so valuable. And on top of that, finally, there's even more. So her constellations are among the best constellations out of all the non-event exclusive 5-stars in the entire game, the standard 5-stars, in my opinion. Her C1 is really, really good if you want to use her E for a big amount of damage. Suck a lot of guys in, shoot them out. When I generally do this, I can do about 38,000 to 40,000 damage. It's really powerful. And C2, you move a lot faster by grabbing one orb. Really good for support, really good for DPS, helps you move around stages, especially during ice stages where your movement speed is already slow. It makes it a lot easier to work with. C3 is just more damage on E and more healing, just really good. C4 is really good for, which reduces Anemo res on enemies affected by burst. So it really helps with characters like Xiao and Venti just deal more damage. And that's why that's why Jean and Venti have some very good synergies with each other. So Venti sucks while Jean drains, essentially. It's just very good combos, and they also just charge each other's bursts in tandem very well. And Jean's E can also hit Venti's enemies while in this burst. So it's also very good value. And then C6 just makes you even more tanky. C5 is also just increases your damage on your skill, which is just really high multiplier and a really short cooldown. And it generates energy. One more thing, Jean is one of the few healers alongside Bennett that can act and Diona that can actually generate particles on their skills, unlike the others. And this turns out to be really, really good. Not only helping the team, but helping themselves get their own bursts active. So nothing to say. Jean's just really good. Access to also Vener, so that's another bonus. But that is the S tier. They're all really good characters, like the top of the line for the whales, in my opinion. And I know this is generally going to be controversial. And now I'm going to move on to my A tier, A plus tier. So these are like almost S tier, but they're like, there is some problems. I do see there's some potential issues rather than the S tier units. And it's not as clear cut. So Diluc is a pretty good character, all things considered. Like I'm sure many of you guys have seen Tony's videos where he one-shots a bunch of stuff with Diluc. He is pretty good of a character. His E combo is really good. Gravestone, we all know, and the Xingqiu for the vape just to get the solid damage from him. Not much to say. He's pretty much like a big beat stick essentially, and just a very decent mainline DPS essentially. Just constellations just give him some more solid damage. And moving on to Child. So Child, I actually don't think Child C6 is too important, albeit I know most people may disagree with me on this. I actually think Child's best usage is this Constellation 4, where it's going to be similar to Hu Tao's Blood Blossoms, essentially dealing, but this does like hydro damage like every couple seconds, and it activates the Riptide effects. And when you compound Riptide effects with Child, he is really good at taking out a bunch of mobs at once. He is probably the best in the game at taking out a bunch of small mobs at once. Riptide easily compounds damage very quickly, and generally, especially with Harp, he's just really good. He solves a lot of energy problems and some cooldown problems on early constellations as well. In Cons 3, we all know it just increases his stance damage, which increases just pretty much all of his damage because you'll be in the stance most of the time anyway. So, but he also has some very good damage on his burst as well, especially if you vaporize on it, but it's a little bit difficult sometimes. His bow Q also generates a good amount of energy, so it's very easy to charge back up. So he is very versatile of a unit, works very well in electrocharge teams, but he also works pretty well in freeze teams as well. So very, very good character. I actually like him a lot, and so people like to say he's been power crept or something, but I don't believe it, to be honest. So moving on to Ganyu, and I think most people find this as a shock that I don't put Ganyu in S tier. And the main reason is that like Xiao at C6 is absolutely busted. He can easily kill everything because he basically has no scaling unless you have infinite uses of E, which is faster than hitting Ganyu's ice arrows, believe it or not, in my opinion, especially when you have the combo set up. But Ganyu is still a really good unit. There is some sort of skill required with Ganyu. You can't no brain like Diluc, Pepega brain, but when you do have decent brain with Ganyu and not have the aim of a boomer, she can do some really good damage, especially with the Amos' bow. And the C6 kind of allows her to become a little bit more of a supportive role, and she does decent damage, and she gets cut 2 copies of her skill. So very, very decent character. And Hong Kong's 1 is probably the most valuable, to be honest, but she is a very solid DPS, much more of a DPS and a sub DPS, unlike a lot of the impressions going into her for 1.2. But yeah, very solid character, can do a lot of damage, go in A+ tier. And Diona is an interesting case. So Diona is a really good value, especially when 1.1 with the Cryo Abyss 12. Obviously, that's not important anymore since it's been over for like a month or 2 months at this point, I think. And so I like Diona a lot because she has she she has very good energy regeneration on her E ability. So equip her with like a Favonius or even a Sack Sword, generate a bunch of particles for your team. Just really, really good overall of a character. And we're not even going into passive. So one of Diona's passives, essentially, when you have shield, you also get increased movement speed. So this is obviously really good on ice fields as well. And just movement speed is a very underappreciated stat, to be honest. Be able to move faster and increases a lot of your options and reduces the amount of stamina you may have to use on field, so you could do some iframes. On top of that, Diona's constellations are pretty good value, actually. Cons 2, it makes your shield stronger, and also just Cons 1, I think, is more healing. I forgot in particular, but they're all really good. And then when we get to her Cons 6 is when things hit like a major overload. So essentially with Cons 6, you get more, Cons 1 is you get more energy on the Q. You get refunded back to you. Cons 6 increases the amount of healing that you get if you're below 50%, and if you're above 50%, you actually get 200 EM. 200 EM is a lot, guys. It's a lot of extra damage, especially when she's a crowd character. So you can easily pair her up with a Pyro DPS and just hit a one big nuke. So you can easily pop in a Bennett Q or a Dilute Q and just get a bunch of damage off at once with a big melt, a big juicy melt. It is very good because Diona is going to be hitting a Cryo, and then you can follow up with a Pyro with the enhanced elemental match you'll get. It's really, really good. Very good healer, very good support, and that's why I like. She does a lot of very good things that support the team: energy regeneration, damage amplification, and healing. Just 3 of the best things. So now that was the A+ tier. These are like really good units that are pretty solid. And now the A tier is these are units that are like generally pretty good. I don't think they're like as good as the A+ tier as a distinction, but they're still very, very solid in their own right. So as for Mona is on here. She's very well as a burst sort of character. I wouldn't say that she's really that great as a DPS and performance-wise. She does get some constellations that kind of helps her deal more on that DPS role, but there are a lot of times they're like gimmicky. I find that the best usage for Mona, to be honest, is just equipping her with an R5 with Sith, and then just hitting off a big freaking juicy melt and vape and just killing everyone essentially. That's probably Mona's best usage. Just quick gameplay. Pop her in, do her stuff, pop her out. Very, very, very quick style of character. And she's very good for setting that up. And also, if you checked out my Freeze video, she has some very interesting applications with Freeze teams for the future as well, in terms of extending the Omen time, the damage amplification, as well as Constellation 4 gives increased crit rate. So you can sort of set things up. If you're fast enough, can set up a reaction for a quick amount, for an easy amount of crit rate, and also damage amplification into your sort of combos. So Mona does have good burst capabilities, though. So moving on to Fish. Fish's C6 is basically what puts her up on A tier in my opinion. Otherwise, she'd be in B. But Fish's C6 is such a game changer. Like, especially for fast-hitting auto characters like Child, she's like arguably one of the best, some of the best duos I've ever seen. Like, essentially, Electrocharge is very much underappreciated in this game compared to Melt and Vaporize. It's just my pure opinion. People don't value it enough, and the unique property of applying 2 elements at the same time with Electrocharge is very interesting to think about in terms of future-proof, like making new sort of combos and ideas that in the future for theory crafters. So Fischl, also just solid DPS, decent DCS character for Fizz. I'm not really a fan of Fizz characters in general, but she is a very solid Fizz character. And Oz is just literally Electro Archon. He's Bird Jesus. At C6, I cannot stress that Oz is basically Bird Jesus at this point. So that's why I put Fischl in A. I don't think she's as good to be put in A+ tier right now, but she's still really, really good on her own. And this may shock a lot of people now. So moving on to Kaya. So Kaya is, I think a lot of people understand now that he's actually a pretty good character. But some people may think he's like, free character. He must be pretty bad. But Kaya has some really good passives, and mainly if he hits an enemy that's frozen with the skill, he also gets more crowd particles, and his multipliers on skill are actually pretty good. But his Q, his burst, provides some of the best crowd application in the game currently at the moment. It's very consistent, and that's just like we're just starting the surface about this. So Kaya has some really, really solid constellations, and especially specifically Constellation 2. So turns out there's like a mistranslation where as long as the enemy got like hit by a cry icicle, I think, and then died from another ability, it still counts towards it. So in that case, and for each of those instances, it extends the duration of his burst by 2.5 seconds. And this can go on for like a pretty good amount of time. There is a limit, I forgot the exact number of it, but essentially allows him to keep on this burst and just keep getting these cryo applications over and over and over. And it's just so awesome. And then Constellation 6 Kaya as well is really good. Adds another icicle, and then it turns his 60 cost burst into a 45, which is really good because it allows you now to even more cycle quickly through Kaya's burst. Not to mention Kaya is also really good as a DPS himself, so generally really good utility overall, and has way more usage than the other two Mondstadt 4-stars that you get for free, to be honest. I highly regard he's one of the best characters, one of the best 4-stars in the game. So moving on to Rosaria, and I know Rosaria is not out yet and things can change. This is just a very tentative review for her, but Rosaria has a very unique sub DPS support functionality. While she can be a decent main DPS, and we'll have to wait to see on that main DPS part, to be honest, she does have a lot of potential as a sub DPS or support, as a crit support type of character, because one of her passives is when she uses burst, it gives a portion of her 15%, I think, of her crit rate to other allies, and that allows you to set up a lot more interesting plays, especially if you have like a Hu Tao or something, or a melt thing in mind. It can be very interesting nonetheless to see. And her E has a lot of range as well, so it can like kind of move you maybe around quickly as a sort of movement option as well. That's just a thing to keep in mind. I'm not really a fan of her for normals right now. They feel a lot more like Claymore attacks, but we'll have to see how that goes. So, but tentatively, she's being put in A tier. I think she has a lot of potential. We'll have to wait and see how it turns out in actuality when she comes out with 1.4. But anyways, let's just move on. We'll see how it goes in a future prep guide. So, Ningguang is got a lot better with the 1.3 patch, and apparently she's getting a lot of issue 6 with 1.4. So it'll be interesting to see how those fixtures are how those changes are implemented. And I would be honest, I have not used Ningguang that much. She's one of the characters I probably use the least, but I do know the capabilities, what she's capable of, and I do watch Darmy a lot, and I do understand some of the limitations that she has, and you know what makes Ningguang as good. And definitely, she has a lot of DPS capabilities, especially with the Geores buffs. And yeah, she was already doing pretty decent damage before Geores, but now it's just even better. And I'm not generally a Ningguang player, but I do have to say she's pretty good at dealing those high damage numbers, especially if you're looking for a Geo type of character. And finally, we have Klee. So the reason why I dropped Klee instead of below Diluc is it's more of like a chaotic sort of thing. So with Klee, a lot of some of the pyro attacks that you're doing, you don't really have much control over for the most part, especially if you want to get like a nice so you basically your only option is vape, so you don't mess things up. Kind of with melts, it gets kind of awkward where you may end up in a situation in which you're only gonna be stuck with a pyro aura, and so it kind of messes things up. She's a fun chaotic sort of character, and it's hard to sometimes control how she plays, and she has a lot of interesting gimmicks and quirks about her that can be sometimes a little bit tricky with timing, especially if you're on mobile. So that's kind of why I put her in A. She's a pretty solid character, but I don't think she's as good as some of the other ones. But I know I'm gonna get a lot of hate because a lot of people love Klee, but trust me, I like Klee too, but I want to, that's just my personal opinion again. So feel free to leave a comment if you disagree. So, okay, that was the A tier. And moving on to the B tier of characters. These are about average characters that do pretty well. So, and I know this is going to shock a lot of people, but I put Albedo and B tier, and my normal tier list, I'd probably put him in A tier. The reason why he drops the tier list on the tier list is because Whale Albedo becomes a lot less valuable, to be honest, at higher constellations compared to other characters. He doesn't really gain too much, all things considered. And so when you can optimize a lot of the stuff, it's a little bit weaker than a lot of characters. But he is still a really good character, especially when it comes to supporting for Zhongli. But the EM is okay-ish when helping with, especially when I ran him with a uh, child and official comp as electrocharged. He generally was okay. The crystallized shields were generally like mediocre. They didn't last too long, but he's still a really solid character. But is he like broken at constellations? Like not really, and he's pretty easy to build. So arguably the second best weapon is Harbinger of Dawn, and his first best weapon is Jade Spear. Not sorry, Jade Spear, Jade's Cade Cutter. So yeah, he's about average. And Sean Ling, I actually put her a lot lower, but I got convinced by a lot of people that, Pyronado does have a lot of benefits. So, but the one thing I think that kills Sean Ling for me is Guoba. Guoba is just very mediocre, very much worse Oz, and only capable of hitting like one enemy and cannot move unless you like push him, and it's a waste of time a lot of the times. All you get's a chili, which gives you a small attack increase. But Pyronado is where the real value lies, and there are some decent constellations for her to increase Pyronado. I'm not really a fan of sometimes about Pyronado how you have to keep like the movement to hit enemies. It's kind of awkward at sometimes. But she is a okay power applicator. I think Ganyu could also get a lot better once we get some better power applicators for that sort of melt team. I just don't think that Sean Ling is the best, and I hope to see some better characters in the future that can really make use of the Ganyu melt sort of comps, especially with the 4-piece Wanderers on her. So, moving on to Sucrose. Sucrose is really good as like a sort of sub DPS EM bot. Originally people called her budget Venti. Obviously, that's generally not the true, and she's just pretty much like helping support other reactions on the field. That's like her whole gimmick. And her CC is pretty decent, but I put her at B tier because first, this is just another sort of personal niche. The CC is kind of okay, and the EM is really solid as well. So she could have gone an A, but this is just some personal thing. Personal. I don't actually put her on here for the EM as much. I like Diona better, as well as she already sets up a lot of value, but Sucrose is very good at setting up a lot of those combos for quick, easy bursts. So if you like that sort of gameplay, you could probably rate her up a tier, but I don't really care too much for that, to be honest. So I put her at B. You could make an argument, though, for A for her. So, Chongus. So Chongus is, Big Chungus is I like to think of him as a sub DPS, to be honest. His autos aren't too impressive, and the thing I'm scared about Chongyun is he kind of messes. He's really good with some characters and awful with others, specifically ones that already have infusions like Kaching and Razor in particular are like the worst offenders of this. But his burst has a lot of value, especially with the way that reverse melt actually works, and so you can get a lot of swords and deal a lot of damage. And when you see a lot of those high damage comps, you see the Chongus, and I probably should have rated him higher. Actually, screw it, I'll rate him higher. I'm gonna rate him higher actually. So because like you can do a lot of damage on burst, and it is very, very good. It's if you set up like a Bennett and then slap up the Chongus, all your swords crit, all your swords melt. Does a lot of damage very quickly, easy clap. Especially if you have like a Wolf's Gravestone. Easiest game of your life. So yeah, I pretty much, and then he also has cooldown reduction as well. So it does benefit the team a great deal, especially with the elemental skill. So Kaching, I know most people like to, shrimp for her as Queen, but generally I think she's like kind of like a mediocre character, to be honest. You can build her like with really decent stats, but a lot of times you end up just like charge attacking, and by charge attacking you also lose a lot of stamina, so it makes it harder to iframe, and you have to walk around, and you're kind of stuck for a bit, and it's like not too impressive. Her constellations too are like okay, they're not too impressive. They do, like, you get the decent amounts of attack and some electro damage bonuses and some damage modifiers, but like nothing too out of the ordinary for her. I think she's a pretty alright character, but is she on the A tier? Does she serve A tier? Arguably not. So I put her down lower, even with Jade Cutter. I think there's a lot of other characters that may be able to outshine should they ever come out, and we'll see how that ends up. We'll see how she ends up turning out. If many characters that may be able to support her in the future, but right now she's like, whatever. I actually raised Beto up from C to B, mainly for the big reason is that if you have a Electro Resonance and you're able to spam into her Elemental Burst, it's really powerful, especially for a character like Child and any melee character. And I generally am not a fan. The reason why I put her in B tiers is I just not a fan of Beto's skill, and I don't like this sort of passive playstyle that she has. Well, I'm not really a fan of having to wait for enemies to do something for me to deal damage. I want to just press E and then swap off immediately. So I do think that's like the biggest fault with her. But other than that, like hitting the electro arcs on the skill, on the burst, it provides very good value and just provides very good synergy for electrocharged teams, especially with Child, and potentially for other Hydro DPSs that may come in the future, because we only really have 2 at the moment, and so 1.5 really, because Mona's not really that much of a DPS. So, but she does have a lot of value for those types of characters. You know, Hydro Claymore win, we'll never know. So, and now we move on to the C tier. So generally, these are lackluster characters in my opinion. And these are characters I feel kind of fall off, especially if you're like high ceiling and there's just way better options in their spots. And so first off on this tier list, on the C6 tier list, we have Barbara. And Barbara's C6 is actually pretty decent, all things considered. It's a real get-out-of-jail-free card. One character dies, brings it back up to a full health. Just keep in mind you can't have Barbara on the field when this happens. So, but it is pretty solid. I'm just not a fan right now, especially with cryo environments of her just kind of underperforming. She'll be pretty decent in pyro environments when that comes out. Not in like 2 years from now, for all we know. And she does have some decent energy recharge on her things, and she does have a insta heal on the burst, but it's just strictly worse than Jean's. Doesn't deal any damage, and all it does is just provide a heal, generally speaking. So I mean, it's all she can do essentially is heal, and generally that's not really what a lot of people are looking for, right? Especially the top tier healers. We notice like they do a lot of other things besides healing, and they can generate good particles. Barbara can't generate any particles on E, and which makes her kind of like a meh sort of character. But the C6 is pretty decent valuable, and that's why I put her in C, not a sort of a D tier. Noelle, I know Noelle can deal decent damage. It's not too great. She's easy to build, but you know, for whales, like you build her because you like Noelle. So not because she's like amazing broken tier unit. You know, generally speaking, Geores makes her okay, but you know, it's sort of like it does okay damage. It's not too great, but it's like and you have to have the burst out, and she doesn't have like the best energy recharge whatsoever to spam into burst. So some people may even run Favonius just to get their energy recharge on her. So getting into burst for your main damage, especially if you use like a main damage dealer, having to rely on the burst with very poor generation is very frustrating, I feel. And I haven't used Noelle too much, all things considered, and maybe I'm just playing her wrong, but I just feel like this is a huge problem for Noelle, and just getting that energy is going to be the biggest struggle ever. So moving on to Xinyan. I know a lot of YouTubers have hyped her up as this really good character. I know OK Code does a lot of cool stuff with her, but all things considered, there are other characters that can do what she can do a lot better. She's generally mediocre. Her shield is like on the weaker end of the spectrum, because you'll end up probably building her as more offensive than defensive, and so to deal some damage. Constellation 2 gives her more crit, her C6 gives her more charge attack, and she does do some Fizz Res down, but I generally think Fizz Res is somewhere on the weaker end of the game, especially because bigger boss type enemies like Ruin Hunters, Ruin Guards, Ruin Graders end up having huge amounts of physical resistance, not to mention probably the Dino Geos. You know, these guys also probably have a very high amount of physical resistance, which makes these characters harder to use, generally her and Razor, all things considered. So I'm just not too much of a fan of how Xinyan plays, and she could be, you know, she's all right, but not necessarily the best. Moving on to Razor. So Razor, I'm not really too much of a fan of. I know a lot of people put him really high, but I generally find that, you know, physical is a lot good on the humanoid enemies like Fatui guys, but especially with the current Abyss right now being like big Ruin Hunter, Ruin Graders, Ruin Guards. He's gonna struggle against those guys because those guys have like 70% biz res, and you could use Superconduct and reduce it, but it's just so much of a struggle on those enemies that I just feel like a lot of the times it's just better to just do an elemental for the most part. But it's just probably me inserting my bias. And defense down is generally not as good as a resistance down, but it's still pretty solid nevertheless, essentially, in how it works in the damage formula. But Razor is just kind of like a left click simulator and just strictly like worse than a lot of the other characters on the list. So decent DPS, but is he like it doesn't make him like that great? Not really. So now moving on to the D tier, the bottom of the barrel. And so starting off with Amber, I think a lot of people already know this at this point. Baron Bunny is really weak. Her C6 is not really too strong, all things considered. It's a small attack boost and a movement speed increase. Hitting 2 Baron Bunnies is pretty much just as bad as 1 Baron Bunny. It's not too much better. Generally a weaker character. People that play her generally play her just for fun and to have a challenge, but not one of the best characters at all, easily. And Lisa, again, Mr. Code is very good at showcasing Lisa. Problem is that there are other characters that kind of do the same thing, but just a lot better with the same gear. So Lisa, the problem for Lisa is that, especially with her E, you're basically just sitting there for like 3 seconds and praying to God you don't get hit. Her C2 gives her some interruption, to resistance interruption, so you can kind of take some hits, but then again, you're a caster. You don't have the highest defense in the game. You're generally casters are generally squishy types of characters, and so it doesn't really help Lisa that much. So you generally want to have those shields for her, and it's just a lot of babying Lisa to get her to get this her hold E skill active on the field. Her burst is generally okay, and she does have some decent energy particle generation, especially if we get the Q there, her hold E off. But is it that worth it? Not really. So again, kind of like a weaker character, and that's why I like Kai a lot better. But that is Lisa. So moving on to Chi-Chi. Oh boy, do I have a lot of things to say about her. I know a lot of people hyped her up as one of the best characters in the game at the start, and I think a lot of people learned, especially near endgame, that she drops off hard. Main reason, as I said earlier with Barbara, turns out having a healer that just heals is generally not good, and there are a lot of other issues. Generally, also healing-wise, Jean does the same thing that Chi-Chi does, but just a lot more better and consistent. And okay, so moving on to very specific parts about Chi-Chi. So, her elemental skill. Going into her elemental skill. Chi-Chi's elemental skill generates no energy whatsoever. It's pretty crappy. The healing is not too great, and you have to have her autos to just generate the good amount of healing. It means you're wasting time doing Chi-Chi autos, which are generally not going to be hitting that hard. So, she has like really low attack. So, on top of that, like I said, having no energy particle generation whatsoever, her burst costs 80. The most expensive bursts cost in the entire game at the moment, with no energy regeneration whatsoever. So you basically have to baby her with other characters to give her enough ER to get her the particles she needs to get the burst out. And what is the payoff of said burst? You hit a bunch of people with talismans and you get some decent healing. The problem is, if the enemy is low, if the character you're trying to heal up is low, they could just end up dying before they get the hit off, or if they have a shield, you may struggle to hit them. It is kind of annoying, and the payoff is generally not that great. You get some healing, and that's pretty much it. And on top of that, with her passive, you can proc the talismans on enemies. The problem is, if you hit a talisman on a low HP enemy and kill them early, you may not get that much healing at all. And in fact, you have to wait a crap ton amount of time. Oh, speaking of which, Chi-Chi has insanely long cooldowns on things. It takes forever to get her elemental skill back up. It is so frustrating, especially with the slow freaking cryo damage that her elemental skill deals. And not only that, you basically have to be right up to the enemy's ball sack to actually hit them for the cryo hits, especially when you're fighting an Electro Fatui member. This is actually frustrating because you could take you like 10 seconds to actually break his shield. And you have to think about it, it's like, well, do I fire off burst and possibly never get her burst off for the rest of the entire floor, or do I wait? Do I potentially lose 10 seconds to try to just break this guy's shield? And like you start to realize at this point that Diona does the exact same thing, but it's just better. Like, it's better in almost every aspect when she just generates particles, particles for your team, and she actually does stuff like elemental mastery, so increases offensive capabilities. Chi-Chi just doesn't do any of this. In fact, she has the highest base defense in the entire game, but doesn't do anything with that defense. So it's like kind of useless. And one fix I do recommend for Chi-Chi, for the devs, if anyone's watching this potentially, is possibly if an enemy is affected by talismans, they should take increased damage, possibly up to 50% increased damage. And people think, wow, 50% is a lot. It's actually not too much, considering that the cooldown is really long and the burst is really expensive, and the duration is not too long. And so it would take a lot of investment to get this out, and it'd be a lot of time before you can get it back up again. It's not as spammable as people think. It's really good if you want to hit down a really quick boss. It would define her as more a single target boss killer, which would be really actually not that bad. It would give her some very unique functionality, and she would have a very decent place in this game. Right now, she is just very much useless. A lot of comps, it's just waste of a hero that provides a waste of time compared to other characters, and just generally doesn't do too much. So I'm sorry I ranted about Chi-Chi for far too long, but I arguably think she is worse than 4 stars and one of the worst 5-star in the game at the moment. Even worse, she was way worse than Zhong pre-buff, even that. I think Zhong pre-buff was probably around B tier, to be honest. And now, finally moving into the Travelers. I mean, Anemo Traveler, the Q is not that great. It pushes enemies away unless you find some gimmick to keep it stuck in there. Windblade is like generally okay, and for the most part, the constellations on the main characters are pretty weak, all things considered, because they know you're going to get C6, so they generally make these constellations kind of bad, because like literally one of the Anemo Traveler's constellations just increased energy recharge, which is kind of garbage considering like other characters' constellations, which gives them a lot more value. It's like, whatever. I mean, if you're cheap to play and just have nothing else, like, they're good. Also, keep in mind that as we get more elements, these older ones are going to become less and less viable. So you may want to keep like the Electro. If the Electro one's really good, if one of the elements is really good, then these elements may have no more value because you can only have one at the time. And you also need to reinvest books into them or your weekly mats into them, which is a big yikes. So you're just wasting mats, throwing them in the garbage, throwing more in the garbage. So that's generally why I'm not a fan of the Travelers, all things considered. The Geo Traveler is not too much better. He does have some decent crit rate, and he does synergize, I guess, with Zhongli's Resonance. But it's kind of like physical type characters, and he's like just generally a beat stick, all things considered. Not too great, but like there is a lot better than him out there. So him or her, I guess, depending on the gender. But anyways, that was the whole list. Hopefully I tried to explain everyone. And again, this is a whale tier list. Don't take it too seriously. If you like a character in their low tier, don't let this video discourage you. Feel free to use whoever the heck you want and have fun. That's the whole point of this game. I just thought it'd be fun to see if I could rate every character in the best possible position they could. How would I compare them at that point? And that was just having some fun, and I just generally had some fun making this list. Nothing too serious. Just feel free to play whoever you want and enjoy the game. This is a game. Just have fun. Anyways, guys, I'll see you guys in the next video. Peace.